That's awesome. We're going to do a couple things, approve some minutes, and then we are going to open up discussion on House Bill 2382. You've got some stuff in front of you. We have some numbers in front of you that we will clarify. But first, if you would grab your minutes packet. You've got a couple of them there. We'll do a, if you haven't looked, take your quick look about our past actions, and then I would entertain a motion. Representative Estes.
With a great deal of gratitude, because I watch Rose and Michelle's work tirelessly over the minutes and the legal review that they get, I move that we approve the minutes as presented.
I have a bunch of seconds, but I'll go with Representative McNorton. You got one, Ed? All right, discussion on that? Seeing none, all in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Aye. All opposed? All right, thank you. Great job, Rose. All right, now I will, no motion yet, because I want to, you have, well, in We're gonna go with my coaching here and not go with a motion yet, but I'd like everyone to take a look at the balloon amendment on House Bill 2382. I'll give Nick some space to give a brief on what this does, and then I'd like to invite Dr. Harwood and Jennifer to give some thoughts and clarity around the fiscal note from the changes of this balloon amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and committee members. So yes, committee, you've got the balloon amendment for House Bill 2382, and just a little background. Recall that House Bill 2382 has already been to this committee, and you all passed it out basically in a clean fashion, but then it got re-referred back to this committee. So we're seeing this for a second time. The way the bill is currently existing now, without the balloon amendment, recall that this would increase the State Board of Education member pay, and that was determined pursuant to a formula that was tied to the legislative salary and front-loaded toward the payment of legislative salary during the months of the session. So that's the current bill. This balloon amendment would strike that formula language, as you can see in subsection B, and it would instead provide amounts certain for legislative pay. So the way this amendment would work is that you see in paragraph 1 of that balloon, members of the Board of Education would receive, for regularly scheduled Board of Education meetings, they would receive $286.81 per calendar day. And I think that's about the amount that the formula was coming up with for a daily rate based on legislative pay in this current fiscal year. So those regularly scheduled board meetings, they'd get that $286.81 per calendar day for the service at those regularly scheduled meetings. And then for attendance, you see in paragraph 2 here, for attendance at any other in-state meeting that's taking part in that pertain to educational interests of the state on behalf of a board member, that member would be eligible to receive and would be authorized to receive $286.81 per calendar day for the member service for the first 12 calendar days of those events. And then for any additional days beyond those 12 calendar days, the member would be authorized to receive $172 per calendar day for the member's services. And committee members and Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Questions, discussion, Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nick, does this in any way cap the number of days that state board members can be paid for meetings and sort of thing?
No, it does not. I mean, this balloon, as you see in paragraph 1, that is for their regularly scheduled board meetings, and there's no cap in this. And then For all other meetings of educational interest pertaining to the State Board of Education, it would be the $286.81 for the first 12, and then for any other meetings, that $172 amount for all others.
Thank you. If I may, I was concerned that it didn't mention the chair and vice chair having more responsibilities, so I think that probably covers it. Thank you.
Yeah, and then I appreciate that, because that's really where, the 24 first days, that's board meetings, and then those other 12 being spread out on an average with the other members, those can be used, and they will need to be, in a sense, voted on every month by the state school board. And as far as a cap goes, I mean, I think the real idea of the cap is the funding. And so once the money is getting close to being used up, it creates kind of its own cap, and so they got to manage that all year. So that was kind of the cap mindset, is around the dollar amount, not setting a day amount, using an average. But Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for clarity, if they ran out of money, it's the expectation that the money allocated in general to the state board would be utilized if the board agrees that more days of compensation are warranted?
Oh, well, Frank was motioning, Dr. Harwood was motioning me, so I'll let him speak to that a little bit of maybe some of the process. And
so I guess this bill would not change the process that we use for that. And so the way we calculate, the way state board allocations go, is that we calculate what it's going to cost us to have the meetings. And then the rest of it is budget that has to be approved by the state board on a monthly basis. And so in January, we actually sent something out to the state board, like, you're running a little heavy on the budget, so we probably need to slow that down. Now, the state board could decide that they need to be meeting more often, and then they would get paid for that. But then we'd have to find other parts of the operating budget to pay for that. So we build the budget on an average of 78 days per state board member, but it's really of a range of about 40 to about 110. And if you are a chair and a legislative liaison, and then the representative from District 5, because it's a great big place, they get that share. So the money that's left over after we say this is what it's going to cost to have the meetings gets divided. That's what we talked about, gets divided up into the shares of, and the share really isn't how many days, it's the amount of money, because in that amount of money is also the subsistence issues or funding when those apply. And those apply the same way they would to you when you're doing things.
And while you're up there, I don't know if we had some other questions. I saw McNorton say, Estes, Representative Estes.
I think it might be helpful to have a little context, because obviously in the past, the state board's salary was tied to ours. And our leadership on both parties, or for both chambers, they get 4 days a year, and that's it. They're done. So I think when I think about it, okay, we're a 90-day session, they have larger districts. I think this is a nice compromise. But there is one thing missing here that I think is something that we would need to put in the future, because most of the time when we pass a bill for the funding task force or something like that, we put in verbiage that we'll be paid. And I think if we do include State Board of Ed members in the future, we need to make sure that we include them in those bills. But I'm comfortable with this solution.
Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so on lines 12, and Nick, this probably goes to you. So on lines 12 and 19, compensation is taken away, but then it looks like they will be compensated. So I'm confused why the words were taken out there.
Yeah, I think that's a very good distinction, and you're I appreciate the careful reading of the bill. So yes, committee, in subsection A, the word, as Representative Steele noted, the word compensation is stricken. So subsection A now, if this bill goes through, will only deal with subsistence and travel expenses. And those would be pursuant to the statute that's listed there, 753212. So state board members could receive subsistence and travel expenses for in-state, out-of-state meetings. But then this compensation piece, their daily rate of compensation or their per diem amount would be dealt with in subsection B. And that would only apply to, as you can see, so for the paragraph 1, for regularly scheduled Board of Education meetings, and then for paragraph 2, only attendance for in-state meetings of educational matters of educational interest to the state. So the compensation would only be essentially for those regular board meetings or other in-state functions.
Can I just follow? Okay. So if they travel, so on line 16, out-of-state meeting, they do not get a compensation for that. They just would get the travel and subsistence.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll come back to you, Representative McNorton. Representative Wynn.
Excuse me. So thank you. So what is the rate of subsistence?
Let me pull the statute up real fast and I'll look at that in a minute.
Representative McNorton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This might be for Dr. Harwood. So as you run out of budget and the school board member still wants to go to whatever, and so that's just basically on their own, like we used to do when we were paid $88 a day during session only, and we still went to the whatever meetings in our district to see people. So is that how that would be looked at?
So a state board member could travel to any meeting they wanted to on their own dime. They can only get paid for something other than the state board meetings if the state board approves that travel. And so if the state board as a whole said, we're out of money and we're not going to approve anything more, then it would be up to the state board member to decide if they were going to go to that or not, with the exception of the state board meetings, which are already kind of budgeted that way. So, I mean, so in that regard, it actually works like, I mean, so 753112 is the same statute for your sustenance and travel expenses. It's the same exact thing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for the question. Nick, did you find some information you'd like to share?
Yeah, and this makes me recall, I did have something in the bill brief that I presented to the committee on this. So subsistence allowance is listed in statute at the sum of $109 per calendar day, except that the statute does state that that amount shall be increased based on the federal government's per diem expenses. So I don't recall the rate that it's currently sitting at now, but it's in the 170s.
178.
Thank you.
So in that first section, subsistence and compensation is looking at both that 286 rate and our 172, but subsistence is looking at the 109 and then the 170, 178.
The 109 was the amount when the statute was written, but it has an automatic escalator based on the federal reimbursement guides. And so that would, again, same thing true for you. It's gone up to 178 based on the CONUS rate. Now, in that same bill, same thing for you, if you travel out of state, you can get the 178 or the actual expenses if greater. And that has to do with if you drive your car, you can get mileage, but if you fly, you just get reimbursed for the ticket. So it's just a method of reimbursing for travel. There's just a flat rate, but if you exceed it, then you can get reimbursed for the actual amount.
But this, just to be clear, does not allow kind of what I got comments around of our state daily rate or compensation rate will not be applied. This other one can be, but the other one will not. Just so you're clear. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question on that you just said there. If we as legislators do out-of-state travel, do we get subsistence?
Nick, I may let you answer that. We do have an expert in the back of the room if he'd like to comment. You walked in right at the right time.
That was timing, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, since I was listening to this, I decided to come on over. No, legislators do not receive subsistence when they travel out of state. They receive actual, up to the federal guidelines of the amount for subsistence purposes. They also receive airline fare and anything that goes along with that. But they do not receive the subsistence amount that legislators would normally receive during the legislative session or during committee meetings or special session.
So this would actually be an additional benefit for State Board of Education members that legislators do not have. Okay.
Let's also then create some clarity around the totals. You have a little bit of a handout around the numbers of what as introduced it would be. That is correct. I think KSDE has, this was an estimate that I received today to kind of see where we're at in the ballpark, but if KSDE would like to provide us the numbers that they said that this amended bill as amended would create.
So for the original bill, we had the fiscal note was $170,000. For the amendment, our fiscal note would be $120,000.
Just so you have that information. Representative Estes.
For clarity, so sorry, did you guys prepare this document?
We did not.
Who did this document come from? From research, okay, thank you.
Representative Wynn.
So that 120,000 on top of what? So what is the total cost, which can't be determined because you don't know travel expenses? But I'll ask anyway, what's the total cost?
Well, the number that I would add would be the 120 plus the 125, the amount budgeted in substitute House Bill 2007 for last year's budget, and that rolled over into this year's budget, and now the ask in this amended bill would be 120,000, so roughly 245.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You want me to say that again? Well, on your sheet, maybe put your hand over the right side. Don't pay attention to those numbers for a second. And look at the amount budgeted in substitute for House Bill 2007 is 125,000. And then this amendment, what we just got a report on, would be 120,000 added to that 125,000. So you're talking about 245,000 roughly.
So again, we did not prepare the document that you're looking at, but for state board compensation, in the 2025 budget, we had $140,000 for state board compensation. And that includes their pay, health insurance, capers, and that health insurance and capers are only if it gets elected, Social Security and Medicare, employer costs, workers' compensation, employer costs, and unemployment insurance, employer's costs. Those last three increase when your pay increases. So in looking at that, the $140,000 for FY '25, we did not include any increases to travel expenses because this bill would not change that in any way. So we had that going to about $310,000 under the first bill, which was an increase of 160. And with amendment, we see that compensation going to about $260,000, which is an increase of $120,000. So so what we are saying is that the bill with this amendment would have an additional compensation cost to state board members of $120,000. So that would be, just like we came in before and asked for $170,000 the first time, we would have asked for $120,000 to fund it.
And when you make amendments, numbers change. So we're sorting it out. Thank you, everybody, for helping sort it out. Questions? Representative Nguyen.
Thank you. That's 120 on top of what is the current salary now?
140. So our budget for the compensation at $88.66 per day, the current amount, is $140,000, along with all of the employer expenses and other benefits. With the change in the daily rate as seen in this amendment, that would go from $140,000 to about $260,000, or an increase of $120,000.
Total?
Total for school board member compensation, yes.
Per member?
No,
No.
10.
total.
10 of them. Okay.
So about $12,000 per member, but again, based on your role on the board, that's going to vary across, quite a bit.
And remember, the genesis of this is when we didn't necessarily vote on our pay raise. Some people voted against it, but there was a study done, and in that study, they looked at comparison with different states and what legislatures were paid, and out of that, there was a very similar, and not possibly argument could be made even more of a raise to legislative body. In this, the state school board was linked to that, and they did not stay linked in that vote, in that calculation. And so they stayed the same as before our raise. And so this year, they came back and had a budget request first. So just the history of how this came down, there was a budget request just to increase at what they thought was an equal rate of pay of what the legislature got. And really wasn't anything statute, it was just a budget request. Took that to, we voted that out. We got that out of this committee, went to appropriations. Appropriations chair said, this needs to not just be a budget item, it needs to be a bill, so it's in statute. And so he let me introduce a bill to correct this through statute over long run. We voted that out, but there was, I think, the clarity around it is difficult to help people understand something that they've really never seen before or never paid attention to before. We have a former state school board member we've had some discussions around this, and I just want it to be out in the open, what the process has been around this and how we are trying to be fair but also consistent in. But this also, just so you know, it keeps the delinked of the legislature and the State Board of Education. So that if they, and I actually kind of like that. There's opinions on both sides, but here's why I like it. I like it from the standpoint of there is a difference. and that if they need a raise, they can come and make that case based on their position and what they are doing specifically to help schools, to help districts, to help the system, and advocate for that. So I like that it creates a unique path for them. It's a step in that direction. It's one of the main things I like about it. And then the pay stuff, it was an attempt to use some of the numbers from the first bill to look at it in a fair way of saying, when are they away from home, in a sense, like a legislator, and up at the State House, or doing away from home official business, whether it's in Topeka or wherever it's at. That could be at this rate, if you use the 78 number as an average across, that's 6.5 days a year, or a month, to where then other members are going to use more of those extra days and other members are going to use less because of the average and the extra commitment. So that is kind of a little bit of the history and a little bit of the why. But I think the clarity around it is important as we take it out of this committee, and maybe that wasn't enough from my part to have more clarity, to ask some deeper questions, to where when we take this out to the next step, there can be good explanation at next conversation levels and next voting levels. So we'd have nothing else to do with this whole committee. So I would like to take action on this at some point, but I am not in a rush, because I think if you've never looked at this, you got a lot of questions, and that's okay. Representative Estes.
If I may ask Nick a question and then make my comment. Nick, how long ago was it that when was it, besides this most recent time, when was the last time the legislature raised their salary? Or was it in the 80s ballpark?
I'd have to look. I mean, the legislative sum of $88 per calendar day is specified in the statute, 46137A. But there's quite a few amendments, so I'd have to kind of go back into the session laws to look, unless I'll browse the.
But it would be fair to say decades and decades, right?
Probably.
Okay. So I like treating the state board separately, because they have a better chance of coming to us and getting a raise when they feel like they need to, than waiting on us to have decades and decades and decades go by before we take action on ourselves. So I think this kind of helps them that way. So I like this. I like the balloon amendment.
Representative Hill, I've skipped you a couple times. Apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know you're not ignoring me. I do think that there's a necessity to do something for the state board. You know, I mean, it's not enough. I have concerns about the subsistence when state board members are out of state, because it's my understanding subsistence, the idea of subsistence is that you come to Topeka or you go to an in-state meeting, and that covers your food and your lodging expenses. That's what it's for. And when we have written in there that their travel expenses will be covered and subsistence, to me that's double dipping on out-of-state trips. And so I would be more comfortable if we would remove subsistence from line 20, I think it is, on that page, and I have no idea what the fiscal note on. I don't think. And the other thing about that is if we're not paying subsistence for out-of-state trips, that makes more money available for board members to use, because essentially there's a cap when it's all said and done. And I guess that leads me to a question. Is there an appropriation note? I mean, when this is, you know, we're coming up with this figure here, so then do you go to appropriations and get that change done? Or, I mean, because right now it's 125,000, right, or 100 and whatever it is, 140,000 that's in there right now. You know, it says 125 in HB 2007. Okay, okay. So then you just need to get, you would have to get that done in appropriations too, or this wouldn't be funded.
From my understanding, this will have to become part of the trailer bill for it because it's not in the current House budget. So the trailer bill, not to be confused with that who shall not be named bill. But yeah, it would have to be appropriated through the trailer bill for the funding. Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question might be for you. I recall last summer, or at the end of our session, leadership decided that we could expense or get paid if we wanted to as legislators to go to ALEC conference, which was out of state. Were we paid subsistence then? Did they make an exception? I didn't go, so I don't know how that worked, but.
I do not know the back end financial aspect of that, but I know the Senate president was getting an order becoming chair of ALEC, and so they made a special arrangement for anybody who would go and be a part of that the conference would be paid for. I don't know the details on the back end of if there was subsistence or our compensation rate, but I would have to ask higher above than me. Representative Owsley.
Thank you. And just along those notes, when CSG Midwest conference was to be held in Wichita, members were compensated to attend that conference as well. So it's been done before.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my comment would just be that leadership decided, and they have their own leadership too. So if we allocate this money, I don't know if it would have to be changed in statute to allow them to decide to not give. I don't know, but it's kind of like one of those local control things. I hate for us to overcomplicate things, which we tend to do here. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would, my caution in not doing this is there may not be anything happen if we don't kind of set a guardrail around in-state only. Representative Hill.
I can't quote it, or I can't do like Nick and run over and grab the statute book, but I think there's a statute that says that legislators will not receive the
Daily rate.
Yeah, the daily rate when they're out of state. I think that's written in a statute. I think Representative Brantley actually had it pulled up here a little bit ago, so. That's just for out of state, like the Wichita, I'm not sure about on that one, but the statute says out of state. And I want to make it clear, I'm okay with the total amount of this. I just think that we should cut that out because I don't think that's good policy to have it included on out-of-state trips.
I agree, but I don't necessarily want us to, my thought on this, if we are decoupling, this is almost, if we're decoupling their pay and our pay, then we're still comparing their pay and our pay in that notion. And I'm not saying we can't, but it's almost a consistency thing for me. If that is something that they do and have done, I would still be okay with basically just saying there's a cap in the funds, and the funds will dry up at the point that they are then supposed to dry up. And they're not going to approve every single trip because they don't have the money to approve every single trip. But I also hear this side of saying, look, if we, this year, if we don't tend to this being more of an in-state mandate and that it's SGF, Kansas State General Funds, we want those dollars to be primarily spent in Kansas doing things, and they are. And I know we're having an elongated conversation around something that most of us agree on, but getting into these details to where we know how to communicate it later is helpful. So I am with you, but I still think once we start talking about that comparison of what happens for us, and we don't want that for somebody else, then we're still kind of in a linked mindset to how they had always been tied to how we had to operate, rather than if they need to operate in a certain way. And I think this gets the ball rolling in that direction. And if they need to come back next year or 3 years from now and say, you know, that out-of-state travel thing, it's really not working, and here's our case as to why and what we need to do about it, I trust that they'll do that. So that would be kind of some of my, I like how it reads now, and if there was, you know, as we start to work the bill, you want to make that motion? Will the committee? I tend to agree with you on moving this forward this year, that it would help, but just saying what I'm thinking. Representative McNorton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask Dr. Harwood, what is your position on the subsistence and the travel? I mean, is it true, once you run out of money, it doesn't matter? I mean.
So, yes, I mean, so we keep the state board apprised of where they're at with their budget. And they have reduced the amount of days they're doing things outside of the meetings. Now, some of that's, we've changed some positions, and some people are doing some things differently, so that's the case. I think the key, and we're talking about out-of-state travel. So the two things that the state board ever really does for out-of-state travel is they sent one person to the National Association of State School Board meetings, and they've sent people when our Kansas Teacher of the Year was a national finalist. And so they rarely travel out of state, so we're not talking about a lot. The bill as amended changes it so that they cannot receive a daily rate of pay for that travel. And then subsistence is the federal CONUS rate. So that's the reason how that is defined is, what does it cost to get a hotel? What does it cost for meals? Each, I mean, different cities have different rates, but that's what that is. So state board members don't get reimbursed for mileage when they're traveling in state. And so it's just a set amount for what it's going to cost for you to live there. You don't get travel and that. You could get travel or that. Is that right? Yeah. So and it's actually the same way I mean, for the most part, when I travel across the state, there is it's like how many, you know, how long you're gone, and then this is what you can get for that, and you can't spend more than the CONUS rate on a hotel, and you get reimbursed for that. I mean, so all those things are part of just travel. And again, the amendment as written takes out the daily rate.
Representative Estes.
So being familiar with the hotel cost in DC, 178 is like good luck, and you're pretty far out. So what happens when we do send somebody to like the National Teacher of the Year finalist, if I understand correctly, that's in DC. So what happens when we send them somewhere where the cost is higher than the subsistence rate? Are they coming to the board and the board's finding money somewhere else, or are they taking it out of their pocket?
So I believe the way 75-32-12 reads is that it's the subsistence rate or the actual amount of the travel, whichever is higher. So if you flew out and it was $200 for a hotel, then you actually get reimbursed for the actual costs. And then so the state board would have to say, well, yes, we want 2 people to go represent us at this National Teacher of the Year finals, and we know that then, well, we're going to have to limit some travel someplace else. That doesn't happen all that often, so it's difficult to budget for. So then I mean, just like anything else that happens, you figure out how to make it work.
Thank you.
I think we might have a solution for this that can be discussed as we begin working the bill. Any other questions? Okay, I would entertain a motion. Representative Hill. Sorry. I was thinking.
Nobody else would raise their hand. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would, can I put that or in there too? Okay, I would move the balloon amendment with one additional exception on line 20, changing the first and to an or. Okay, did you catch that, Nick? Okay, so it says, it's line 20 on the original bill, and it changes after expenses, it goes expenses or subsistence expenses. And then all the rest of the balloon remains the same.
Representative McDonald, seconded. Representative Nguyen, discussion.
So what happens then on line 12 and 13? That's in-state.
Call on Representative Hill to make that response in the microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, the place on line 12 there, that's for in-state travel, and the subsistence applies for in-state travel. And so that doesn't need to change. It's only the out-of-state that's the issue.
Representative Nguyen.
And I guess this is Nick. What is included under or allowances provided in KSA 753212?
For everybody, I think it's on line 13 that she's referencing.
Yeah, that language of allowances seems throughout the statute to refer to subsistence and travel or mileage. I mean, it's kind of a broad term that applies to any and all of those things.
Any other questions or comments, discussion on the amendment? Representative Nguyen.
So what is the rationale again for changing the and to or?
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Nguyen, when I look at the expenses being paid, the travel expenses for out-of-state travel, to me, subsistence is what it costs us when we travel within state for meals, hotels, et cetera. We don't declare specific expenses, we get subsistence, like when we're in the legislature. So when you're going out of state and you're getting those expenses already covered, to me, it is double, for lack of a colloquial term, double dipping to get the subsistence and the expenses paid for.
And so this would basically create the situation where whichever is the actual expense, whether it's on the subsistence side or the travel expenses, they would take either or of those, not both. Further discussion on the amendment. Representative Owsley.
Thank you. And at the risk of sounding ignorant, what is the definition of travel expenses and the definition of subsistence expenses?
Nick?
So interestingly enough, well, 753212 doesn't talk about necessarily travel expenses, and I think that's what subsistence expenses is getting at. 723212 actually talks about mileage rates for travel, but yeah, so, I mean, they might be kind of similar in what they're getting at. I mean, I also don't do this or apply this statute like the agencies do, and like.
Make a request for an explanation. Dr. Harwood.
It's actually just what, my understanding is, it's just what Representative Hill talked about. Subsistence is a way that you've calculated, this is how much money we're going to give you for what a day usually costs. And so in that are what the, you know, what we think a hotel is worth, what we think each of the meals are. Travel expenses are what the actual costs are. And so in 713212, when you get down towards the end, for out of state, you can't get both. You either get subsistence or travel, and if travel is greater, then you can apply for the travel. But there you have to keep the receipts. In subsistence, typically you don't have to keep the receipts. It's just, this is what we think is a fair price to do that. You can spend more, you can spend less, but this is what you get for it. And so the or, I think, is already in the bill, or in the statute that's referenced in the bill. So it would, I guess what it might do is doubly clarify that you can't get subsistence or travel. You only get one of them. And then 3212 defines some of those things about, so it does talk about if you have to drive your own car out of state, you can get mileage rates, but if you fly, then you just get reimbursed for the ticket. So it's how you figure out what the travel expenses are, but again, you can't get both.
Thank you for the clarity. Further discussion? All right, seeing none, remembering that we are on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Any recorded? Everybody okay? Motion passes. All right, now we're back on the bill. We have amended it. We're back on the bill. In discussion, I'd entertain a motion. Representative Estes?
I move that we report 2382 favorably, as amended.
I promised Rose I would say that we were going to report HP 2382 as amended favorably is the motion. Do I have a second? Mr. Schwartfigger, way to go. Any discussion? Just amended. All right, seeing no discussion, all in favor, say aye. All opposed? All right, motion carries. All right, committee, thank you for getting into the weeds and the details. They matter. Appreciate it.
Consent calendar?
I better not. All right, is there anything else for the good of the committee? All right, everyone, thank you. Enjoy your dinner. We are adjourned.